The grand ballroom of the Wellington Convention Center shimmered under the glow of 1,000 tiny lights embedded in the ceiling, like a fake night sky watching over a very expensive party. The air smelled of fancy perfume, polished wood, and the subtle anxiety of people trying to seem important. Men in crisp suits and women in elegant dresses stood in small clusters, holding delicate glasses of champagne, their laughter a practiced, bubbling sound. This was the annual gala for the city's Arts and Philanthropy Foundation. The biggest night of the season for the cultural crowd dotted the very edge of the wide, empty stage, almost lost in the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain. Sat a woman at a piano. The piano was a beautiful, sleek Steinway, its black surface reflecting the muted lights. The woman, whose name was Elena, looked like she was part of the furniture. Her dress was plain and black, the kind meant to disappear. She was 28, with quiet eyes that watched the room, while her hands moved across the keys. Her fingers played a gentle, rolling melody. It was something familiar, a jazz standard from decades ago. The music was nice. It was pleasant. It was absolutely, completely forgettable. That was the point. Elena was what they called the atmosphere pianist. Her job was not to be heard, but to be felt in the background, like the hum of air conditioning or the gentle clink of glasses. She was the sound of money and comfort. Before the guests had arrived, the event coordinator, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper frown named Mr. Aldrich, had given her very clear instructions. He had tapped his clipboard and said, "Remember, you are ambience. You are the wallpaper. Keep it light, keep it simple, and above all, keep it quiet. We don't want anyone actually listening to you. The focus is on the honorees and the speakers. Understood?" Elena had simply nodded. She was used to it. For years, she had been playing in places like this: hotel lobbies, corporate parties, fancy restaurants. Places where music was a product, a service, not an art. She had studied for this once. She had spent hours every day in a small practice room, her soul poured into complex concertos and powerful sonatas. She had dreamed of stages, but not like this one. Not a stage where she was invisible. Her eyes drifted from her sheet music, a book of safe, simplified arrangements of popular songs, to the main tables at the front of the room. And there he was, the guest of honor, Maestro Alistair Thorne. A cold, familiar knot tightened in Elena's stomach. Thorne was a giant in the world of classical music, a conductor known across the country. He was in his late 60s now, with a crown of white hair and a posture so straight it looked painful. He was also known for his brutal honesty, which was just a nice way of saying he could be cruel. 5 years ago, fresh out of music school and burning with hope, Elena had managed to get into one of his prestigious master classes. It was her big chance. She had prepared for months, working on a difficult piece by Chopin. She had played her heart out in front of him, in a room full of other talented students. When she finished, there was a quiet moment. Then Thorne had adjusted his glasses, looked down at his notes, and spoken in a voice that was dry and clear as ice. "Adequate technique," he had said, not even looking at her. "You hit all the correct notes. But music is not about correct notes. It is about courage. It is about saying something. You." He had paused, searching for the word. "You played it safely." It was devoid of courageous interpretation. "Next performer, please." That was it. Devoid of courageous interpretation. The phrase had echoed in her head for years. It had followed her from audition to audition, where she would see the judge's bored eyes and play it safe, just like he said she did. It had led her here, to this shadowy corner of this grand ballroom. Playing musical wallpaper, she dragged her gaze away from him, forcing her attention back to her hands. She switched to another tune, something by Cole Porter. It sounded hollow. The chatter in the room was a low wall of noise. She could hear pieces of conversations, talks about stock portfolios, gallery openings, and gossip about people she didn't know. No one was listening to the music. A waiter passed by her, balancing a tray of empty glasses, and didn't even glance her way. Elena felt a deep, weary sadness settle over her. This was it. This was where her love for the piano had led her, to be a ghost in a room full of the living. She thought of the old upright piano in her small apartment, scarred with coffee cup rings and sheet music piled high. That was where the real music lived, where she played the pieces that stirred her soul, the powerful rhythms of contemporary composers, the aching melodies of modern piano works. Music that spoke of storms and heartbreak and joy. Not this. This pleasant nothing. The ceremony was beginning. The house lights dimmed slightly, and a spotlight hit the podium in the center of the stage. Mr. Aldrich scurried out, gave a tight smile to the audience, and introduced the first speaker. It was a local politician talking about funding for the arts. His voice was loud and confident, but the words were empty, full of phrases like synergistic outreach and community investment. The audience clapped politely. Elena's part was officially over for now. She kept her hands in her lap, watching. Speaker after speaker came up. A corporate donor, a museum director. Each speech was drier than the last. The air, once buzzing, grew heavy and still. You could feel the energy draining from the room. People shifted in their seats. Soft coughs echoed. Eyes glazed over, staring at the elaborate centerpieces on the tables. Maestro Thorne sat through it all, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. He didn't fidget or look bored. He just existed, a monument to proper behavior. Elena wondered if he was thinking about the music he could be conducting instead, something powerful and real, not this parade of words. Then came a speaker, the head of an urban planning committee. His voice was a low, steady drone. He had a slideshow, but the projector was slightly out of focus. He talked about zoning laws and pedestrian flow for 20 minutes. It was the final straw. The collective patience of the audience wore so thin you could almost hear it snap. A man in the third row was surreptitiously checking his phone under the table. A woman was stifling a yawn. And then it happened. The speaker leaned into the microphone to make a point, and a piercing shriek of electronic feedback ripped through the ballroom. Everyone flinched, hands flying to ears. The speaker jumped back. "Oh, dear. Sorry about that," he said, his voice now booming and distorted before cutting out completely. The sound technician had pulled the plug. For a moment, there was pure, utter silence, a shocking, awkward void after so much noise. Then a frantic movement in the wings. Mr. Aldrich was there, his face pale. He locked eyes with Elena. He pointed violently at her, then at the piano, his mouth shaping the words. "Play. Fill it. Now." Her heart, which had been beating slowly in a rhythm of boredom, suddenly slammed against her ribs. Her mind went blank. The sheet music in front of her was a blur of safe, simple tunes. Play what? The cheery jazz standard from earlier? Now? In this thick, uncomfortable silence? Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling. This was her moment to follow orders, to be the good ambience, to plaster over the awkwardness with something sweet and meaningless. But as she panicked, her eyes swept across the front row of tables. They landed on an older woman sitting near the end. The woman had kind, tired eyes framed by wrinkles. She wasn't looking at the flustered speaker or the frantic coordinator. She was looking right at Elena, and seeing the fear on the pianist's face, the woman offered a very small, very understanding smile. It was a tiny shared moment in the chaos. A look that said, "I know. This is all a bit much, isn't it?" That smile did something to Elena. It cut through the panic. It reminded her that this room wasn't just filled with important suits and trophies. It was filled with people. People who were bored, tired, and probably longing for something real just as much as she was. The orders from Mr. Aldrich echoed in her head. Asterisk, keep it simple. You are ambience. Asterisk, the cold critique from Maestro Thorne echoed deeper, devoid of courageous interpretation. In that split second, standing on the edge of a silent waiting room, Elena made a choice. Her fingers, which had been poised to play something safe, moved of their own accord. They found a different set of notes, not on her sheet music, but from a place deep in her memory. They pressed down on the keys. The sound that came out was not cheerful jazz. It was not simple. It was a single, clean, haunting note. Then another. A slow, beautiful, and aching melody began to unfold, note by deliberate note. It was the beginning of a piece called Nouvelle Bianche by a composer named Ludovico Einaudi. It was a piece she played for herself when the world felt too loud or too quiet. It was a piece that felt like a slow sunrise after a long, dark night. She had broken the rule. She was no longer the wallpaper. She had decided, for the first time in a very long time, to speak. The first few notes were like drops of cool water falling into the dry, heavy silence. They didn't shout. They didn't try to cover up the awkwardness. Instead, they acknowledged it. The sound was clear, simple, and filled with a gentle sadness that felt honest. Elena, after pressing down on those first forbidden keys, felt a jolt of pure terror. Asterisk, what have I done? She thought. Her eyes flicked to the wing. Mr. Aldrich was frozen, his mouth a perfect circle of shock. He wasn't gesturing anymore. He was just staring, a man watching a train veer off its tracks in slow motion. She expected him to come running out, to wave his arms, to stop her, but he didn't move. The terror was hot and sharp, but under it, something else stirred. It was a strange, defiant calm. The gate was open. There was no going back to the safe, boring tunes now. So she let her hands go. She stopped thinking about the notes and started feeling them. She closed her eyes. The grand ballroom, with its glittering lights and important people, faded away. In her mind, she was back in her small apartment. The street light was coming through the window, falling on the worn keys of her old upright piano. Her cat was curled on the bench beside her. This was the music she played for no one, for herself. It was her private language. The piece, Nouvelle Bianche, which means white clouds, began to build. It wasn't a loud piece. Its power wasn't in volume, but in feeling. The left hand settled into a repeating, rocking pattern like a heartbeat, or like waves gently lapping ashore. Over this foundation, her right hand began to trace a melody that was both incredibly lonely and strangely hopeful. It rose, hesitated, fell back, and then tried again. It sounded like a person remembering something beautiful and a little painful. It sounded like longing. In the audience. The change happened one person at a time. The first shift was in the quality of the silence. The awkward, squirming silence of a few moments before melted away. It was replaced by a new kind of quiet, a listening quiet. The man who had been checking his phone slowly put it down on the tablecloth, screen dark. He didn't look at it again. The woman who had been stifling a yawn let her hand fall to her lap. Her face, tight with boredom, softened. She looked toward the stage, not at the empty podium where the speaker had been, but toward the shadowy corner where the music was coming from. The elderly woman in the front row, the one who had given Elena that small, kind smile, let her eyes close. A deep line of tension between her brows, a line that had probably been there all evening, slowly smoothed away. Her shoulders, which had been held up near her ears, relaxed. She wasn't just hearing the music. She was resting in it. Near the back of the room, a young man who was there, because his parents had made him attend. A teenager lost in a sea of adults felt something prick behind his eyes. He didn't know why. The music wasn't telling a specific story he knew, but it felt like something he understood. It felt like being on the outside. It felt like trying to find a place where you fit. He sat up a little straighter down up on the stage. The camera operator was a practical person. His job was to point the camera at the action. The action had been at the podium. Now the podium was empty. The only thing happening was this music. He swiveled the heavy camera on its stand. The lens, like a giant mechanical eye, turned and focused. It zoomed in, not on Elena's face yet, but on her hands. Her hands appeared on the two massive screens flanking the stage. They were shown in beautiful, high-definition detail. People could see the strength in her fingers, the fluid grace of her movements. They could see a small, faded silver ring on her right hand. They could see the slight, almost invisible tremor in her left pinky as it held down a soft, low note, not from fear, but from the intensity of the feeling she was pouring into it. Then the camera operator panned up. Alana's face filled the screens. Her eyes were still closed. Her expression was not one of a performer seeking applause. It was raw and private. It was full of concentration, yes, but also of a deep personal feeling. A single tear, caught in the harsh stage light, traced a path from the corner of her eye down to her jawline. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't even seem to know it was there. The audience saw it. And in that moment, the last pretense of the evening shattered. This wasn't a hired musician playing background noise. This was a person, a real person, showing them a piece of her soul. And it was breathtakingly beautiful. At the head table, Maestro Alistair Thorne experienced the music in a different way. When the first unfamiliar notes had sounded, his head had snapped toward the piano. His first reaction was pure professional displeasure. This was a breach of protocol, an insult to the program, an amateurish display of ego from a background player. His lips pressed into a thin, white line. He listened with a critic's ear, waiting for the mistake, the clumsy phrasing, the emotional overindulgence that would confirm his judgment. But the mistake didn't come. The phrasing was perfect. It was not the interpretation he would have chosen. It was slower, more spacious than how it was often played. But it was not devoid of courage. On the contrary, it was all courage. It was vulnerable. It was a direct line from the woman's heart to the piano strings, with no filter in between. He remembered her. The quiet student from the masterclass all those years ago. He remembered his words. Devoid of courageous interpretation. He had said that to fill the air, to move the class along, to make a point about risk-taking. He had never thought about the person on the receiving end, about how those words might become a cage. And now, here she was, breaking out of that cage in the most public way possible. Not with a loud, flashy concerto to prove her technique, but with this. With a piece of such quiet, devastating honesty that it was silencing a room full of jaded, tired people. He stopped hearing it as a critic. He began to hear it as a man. The music seeped past the wall of his professional pride. It reminded him of his own younger self, full of fire and something to prove. It reminded him of the reason he had fallen in love with music in the first place, not for the awards or the prestige, but for this exact, wordless power to connect, to move, to mean something. His stern expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. The ice in them seemed to thaw, just a little. He was no longer looking at a disobedient pianist. He was witnessing an artist. And against his will, he felt a strange sense of pride, as if a lesson he had failed to teach properly had been learned anyway, in its own time, in its own way. Meanwhile, the music continued to weave its spell through the hall. The repeating pattern in the left hand was like breathing now. The melody in the right hand soared higher, a hopeful climb out of the earlier sadness. It was no longer just a private grief. It was becoming a shared release dot, and that's when the young man at the back did something. He didn't plan it. He didn't think about it. The music was lifting, and he felt a physical need to rise with it. It was an instinct, like standing for a national anthem, but this was more personal. It was a gesture of respect, of being fully present. Slowly, almost clumsily, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He wasn't trying to start a standing ovation. He was just standing, as if by getting to his feet, he could be closer to the sound, could be a part of it. He stood alone for a few heartbeats, his face pale but determined, looking straight at the image of Elena on the big screen. Then, the elderly woman in the front row saw him. She understood. Without a second thought, she placed her hands on the table and, with a little effort, pushed herself up onto her feet. She nodded gently to the young man, a connection across the crowded room dot. It was like the first domino falling. The young man standing at the back of the ballroom felt a hot wave of self-consciousness wash over him. What was he doing? Everyone else was sitting. He was making a scene. For a second, he thought about dropping back into his seat, pretending he had just stretched his legs. But then he saw the elderly woman in the front row stand up too. She didn't look at the crowd. She just looked toward the piano, her face calm and serious. Her standing felt like a permission slip. It told him he wasn't alone in what he was feeling, and the feeling was too strong to ignore. The music was pulling him up. It wasn't a happy, cheering kind of music. It was something deeper, like a memory or a truth he'd forgotten. Standing felt like the only honest thing to do. It wasn't clapping. It was more like bearing witness. Then, something even more surprising happened. The man sitting next to the elderly woman, her husband perhaps, looked at her. He saw the look on her face, a look of deep, quiet understanding. He placed his wrinkled hand over hers on the table for a brief moment. Then he too, with a soft grunt, pushed back his chair and stood. It was like a slow, gentle wave beginning to roll through the room. At a table of young professionals near the middle. A woman in a sharp blue suit had been fighting a lump in her throat since the camera had shown the tear on Elena's cheek. She was a lawyer, used to being tough, used to holding everything in. This music, this raw display of feeling, was undoing her in the most beautiful way. She thought of her father, who had loved the piano, who had passed away the previous winter. This music sounded like how she missed him, not sharp and angry, but soft, deep, and always there. When she saw the two older people stand, something broke inside her. She stood up, smoothing her suit jacket, not caring if her mascara was running. Her colleague next to her, a man who usually talked only about golf and quarterly reports, was staring at his own hands, folded on the table. He was thinking about the piano lessons his mother had forced him to take as a boy, and how he had quit, calling it boring. He remembered the look of disappointment on her face, a look he hadn't thought about in 30 years. The repeating left-hand pattern of the music felt like that memory, persistent and gentle. He stood up, not looking at his colleague, his face thoughtful. One by one, the wave continued. It wasn't a frantic rush. It was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. A college student stood. A couple in their 40s, holding hands under the table, stood together. A stern-looking hotel manager, who had been overseeing the event staff, paused his quiet instructions and simply stood by the service doors, his clipboard held against his chest. Back in the shadowy wing of the stage, Mr. Aldrich finally unfroze. But the anger and panic he expected to feel didn't come. Instead, he felt a confusing rush of other emotions. He watched the audience rise, not in chaos, but in a kind of unified, silent response. He had organized hundreds of events. He had seen standing ovations, but they were always loud, predictable at the end of something. This was different. This was happening in the middle. This was quiet. It was powerful in a way he didn't understand. His job was to control things, to keep to the schedule. This was the ultimate loss of control. But as he looked at the faces on the screen's Elena's transported face, the faces in the audience filled with emotion, he realized something. For the first time all night, maybe for the first time in many of his events, every single person in this room was present. They were not thinking about what came next or checking the time. They were right here, connected by a single thread of sound. And he had not planned it. In fact, he had tried to prevent it. The thought humbled him. He lowered his clipboard to his side, his shoulders slumping just a little. He just watched. On stage, Elena was in another world. The fear was gone. So was the ballroom, the audience, the maestro. All that existed was the flow of the music from her heart, down her arms, through her fingers, and into the piano. She could feel the vibrations of the big instrument through the floor and in the bones of her hands. She was not playing the notes. She was releasing them. She reached a part of the piece where the melody climbs. It was a climb of hope, a fragile reaching for light. Her right hand danced a little higher on the keys, the notes shining and clear. It was the sound of struggle giving way, not to a cheap victory, but to a hard-won peace. And as the music reached this point of light, the wave of people standing reached its peak. It was no longer a few scattered souls. Whole tables were rising now. The soft sound of shifting chairs and rustling clothes was the only accompaniment to the piano. It was a quiet human symphony of its own. Finally, at the head table, there was only one person left seated, Maestro Alistair Thorne. All around him, the city's dignitaries. His peers, his admirers, were on their feet. He remained, a statue in his chair. His mind was a battlefield. The professional in him, the stickler for rules and order, screamed that this was wrong. The program was ruined. The hierarchy of the evening, with him at the top, was overturned by a background pianist. But the musician in him, the part he had buried under decades of fame and criticism, was hearing something he had not heard in a long, long time. Truth. This was not a performance for him. It was not a performance for anyone. It was an offering. And the audience, with their silent, standing response, was accepting it in the most profound way possible. He watched Elena. He saw the complete absence of performance in her posture. She was not playing at the audience. She was playing, and the audience was happening to be there, lucky enough to hear it. His own words came back to him, not as a critique of her, but as a critique of himself. Devoid of courageous interpretation, had his own music lately been courageous? Or had it been polished, perfect, and safe? When was the last time he had taken a real risk, had made himself this vulnerable on stage? The music began its final descent. The hopeful climb softened, settling back into the gentle, rocking heartbeat of the opening. It was coming home. It was a resolution, not a finale. Maestro Thorne made a decision. Slowly, with a stiffness that was both his age and the weight of the moment, he placed his hands on the arms of his chair. He pushed himself up. It was not the quick, energetic leap of the younger people. It was a royal, deliberate rise. Every eye in the room, already on the standing crowd, now flicked to him. He was the final holdout. His standing was the period at the end of a sentence. He did not turn to look at the audience. He kept his gaze fixed on the pianist in the shadows. And then he did something he almost never did in public. He broke his own mask. His stern expression softened, just a fraction. And he nodded. A single slow, deep nod. It was not a nod of approval for a job well done. It was a nod of recognition. Artist to artist. It was an acknowledgement that she had something he had forgotten, and she had just reminded him. Elena, her eyes still closed, felt the music coming to its natural end. The last few notes were simple, peaceful. They hung in the air, pure and quiet. And then she lifted her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick and full, like the air after a rainstorm. It was not an empty silence waiting to be filled. It was a silence that was part of the music itself. The final resting chord. For 5 long seconds, no one moved. No one clapped. The audience stood, a forest of people in the dim light, just breathing in the quiet. Elena opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the blinding spotlight that had somehow found her. Then her vision adjusted, and she saw them. Every single person, standing, looking at her. Her heart, which had been steady in the flow of the music, suddenly hammered against her ribs. A rush of sound flooded back into her ears, the hum of the lights, her own ragged breath. Confusion crashed over her. Had something happened? Why was everyone standing? Was it protest? Had she messed up so badly? Her eyes, wide and vulnerable, scanned the crowd. She saw the elderly woman, who was now smiling, tears on her cheeks. She saw the young man at the back, his face full of awe. She saw the lawyer dabbing her eyes, the husband holding his wife's hand tightly, and then she saw him, Maestro Thorne, standing tall at the front. And he was looking right at her. He wasn't smiling, but he placed his right hand flat over the left side of his chest, over his heart. And he gave her that same slow nod again. In that moment, she understood. They weren't standing against her. They were standing with her. They had heard her, really heard her. And then the silence broke. The silence shattered, but it didn't break into noise all at once. It started from the front, near where the elderly woman stood. It was a single clear sound of 2 hands coming together. One clap, and another joined it, right beside her. It was her husband, his old, thin hands meeting in a soft, deliberate pat. It wasn't loud or fast. It was measured, like a heartbeat coming back to life. That sound seemed to release something in the room. The spell of quiet was broken, but what followed wasn't the polite, expected applause of a gala. This was something different, something deeper. The applause didn't roar. It swelled. It started as a wave of soft, sincere clapping that grew and grew, gathering strength from every corner of the ballroom. It was warm, sustained, and filled with a kind of gratitude that went far beyond enjoyment. Elena, still sitting on the piano bench, felt the sound hit her like a physical force. She flinched, her body bracing for a different kind of impact, for shouting, for Mr. Aldrich storming out to fire her on the spot. But this was praise. It was a wall of human warmth rolling toward her. For a second, she was completely disoriented. Her mind, which had been floating in the private world of the music, struggled to catch up. They were clapping. For her. The wallpaper. The ambience. Her hands trembled in her lap. She didn't know what to do with them. She looked down at them, these ordinary hands that had just done something extraordinary, and then she looked back up at the sea of standing, clapping people. A choked sound, half a sob, half a laugh, escaped her lips. She was completely overwhelmed. Her eyes found Mr. Aldrich in the wing. He was still standing there, but he wasn't scowling. He was just watching. And then, slowly, he began to clap too. It was a small, almost bewildered motion, as if he was learning how to do it for the first time. He met her gaze and gave a small, stiff shrug that seemed to say, "Well, look what you did." Then, a movement from the head table caught her eye. Maestro Thorne was still standing, his hand still over his heart. But now, he brought his other hand up and joined it in a single, powerful clap. And then another. His applause was not fast, but each clap was sharp, definitive, like a stamp of approval. He wasn't clapping for the crowd. He was clapping for her directly. The man whose words had haunted her for years was now, in the most unambiguous way possible, taking them back. A flood of emotion, so strong it was dizzying, rushed through Elena. It wasn't just pride or happiness. It was a profound sense of release. The cage she had built around herself, with bars made of his old criticism and her own fear, simply dissolved. It vanished in the sound of this honest human applause. Tears, real and unrestrained, now streamed freely down her face. She didn't try to hide them. There was no point. They had already seen everything. She did the only thing that felt natural. She stood up. Her legs felt weak, like jelly, but they held her. She took one small, hesitant step away from the piano, toward the edge of the shadow that had hidden her all night. She wasn't stepping into the spotlight to take a bow as a conquering hero. She was just stepping forward to acknowledge them, to say thank you without words. She placed her own hand over her heart, mirroring the maestro's earlier gesture, and gave a deep, shaky nod to the audience. Then she turned slightly and gave the same nod to him. It was an acknowledgment of the strange full-circle moment they now shared. The applause surged louder in response. People started cheering now. A few whistles cut through the air from the back, where the younger attendees stood. The sound was joyful, celebratory. On the big screens, her face was still projected. The tear-streaked, overwhelmed, grateful face of a person who had been seen for the first time in a very long while. It was a powerful image, more powerful than any of the polished award speeches that had come before it. Slowly, the applause began to change. It didn't fade, but it softened again, becoming more rhythmic, more expectant. People were looking from her to the empty podium and back. The ceremony was in shambles. The schedule was dead. What happened now? The urban planning speaker, whose microphone failure had started it all, had been standing awkwardly to the side. Now, he walked slowly back to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, which was live again. The crowd's noise died down to a respectful murmur, curious. He cleared his throat. He looked out at the audience, then at Elena, who shrank back a little, unsure. "Well," he said, his voice echoing softly in the now quiet room, I believe my time is up." A gentle, knowing laugh rippled through the crowd. "And I think," he continued, "we have all just been reminded what these events are truly supposed to be about. Not just talk, but feeling. Not just ceremony, but connection." He turned fully to face Elena. "Young lady, I came here to talk about building communities with bricks and roads. You just built one out of thin air. Thank you." He began to clap again, directing it at her. The audience joined in for another brief, warm round. From the head table, another figure rose. It was the chairwoman of the foundation, a formidable woman in a silk dress. She approached the podium, and the speaker yielded the floor to her gracefully. She smiled, a genuine, bright smile that transformed her entire face. "I think we can all agree the schedule for the evening has been beautifully interrupted," she said. The crowd chuckled in agreement. "We had many more awards to give. But sometimes the universe gives us an award instead. An unexpected gift." She looked at Elena. "We hired you to be part of the background. You ended up giving us the heart of the evening. On behalf of everyone here, thank you for your courage and for your breathtaking talent." She then looked out at the audience, her tone turning practical but warm. "Given the emotional shift in the room, I propose we take a short intermission. Let's refresh our drinks, share our thoughts, and let our wonderful musicians in the corner there." She gestured to the small jazz ensemble that had been waiting to play dance music later. "Start a little early." We'll reconvene for the final awards in, let's say, 20 minutes. It was the perfect thing to do. It gave people a chance to move, to talk, to process the incredible shared experience they had just had. A gentle jazz tune started up from the main stage, a smooth contrast to the intense piano piece. But no one rushed for the bar. Not at first. Instead, a crowd began to move toward the front of the room. Toward the piano. Elena watched them come, a new kind of nervousness setting in. She wasn't used to attention. She took a half-step back toward the safety of her bench. The first to reach her was the elderly woman from the front row. She didn't say anything at first. She simply reached out and took both of Elena's still trembling hands in her own. Her hands were cool and papery thin. She held them tightly, looking into Elena's eyes. Her own eyes were shining. "You took what was in here," the woman said softly, patting her own chest with their clasped hands, "and you put it out there. For all of us. That is a rare and beautiful thing. Don't you ever stop." Elena could only nod, squeezing the woman's hands in return. Words stuck in her throat, and others came. The young man from the back mumbled, That was sick. In the best way a teenager knows how to compliment something profound. The lawyer in the blue suit said, "You moved me more than any speech I've ever heard." People touched her shoulder, smiled, said, "Thank you." They didn't ask for her name or her card. They just wanted to make contact, to complete the connection the music had started. And then, the crowd near her subtly parted. Maestro Alistair Thorne was walking toward the piano. The chatter around them faded to a hush. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. "Elena," he said. His voice was low, but it carried. He remembered her name. The sound of it from his lips felt significant. She straightened up, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Maestro." A long pause hung between them, filled with the distant sound of jazz and murmured conversations. He seemed to be choosing his words with great care. "Interpretation," he began, "is not about doing what is expected. It is about finding the truth you have to tell within the notes." He gestured vaguely toward the piano. "What you did tonight, that was not an interpretation of Einaudi. That was an interpretation of Elena, and it was fiercely courageous." He paused, his stern eyes holding hers. "I was wrong, all those years ago. Not about your playing that day, perhaps, but about the finality of my judgment. A teacher's worst error is to mistake a seed for a stone." He gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "It seems you needed no teacher after all. You simply needed to stop listening to old, foolish men like me." He didn't smile, but he extended his hand to her, not for a handshake, but palm up, a gesture that was almost courtly. It was an honor to listen. Elena, her heart so full she thought it might burst, looked at his offered hand. Then she placed her own in it. His grip was firm and warm. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage. He gave her hand one firm shake, then released it. He gave her one final, slow nod, turned, and walked back through the crowd, which respectfully opened a path for him. Elena watched him go. The world felt new, and terrifying, and unbelievably bright. The woman who had been told to play a simple tune had played her truth instead, and an entire room, led to their feet, had answered back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Elena, but it was a beautiful, glowing blur. The formal part of the ceremony eventually resumed, but the air in the room had changed completely. It was lighter, warmer, more connected. People smiled at each other more easily. When the final awards were given, the applause felt more genuine, less like a duty. Elena did not go back to the piano. Her work for the night, in the way she was hired for, was clearly over. Mr. Aldrich had appeared at her side, looking flustered but not angry. "I think we'll have the ensemble take it from here," he said, avoiding her eyes for a moment before looking at her. There was a new respect in his gaze. "You should mingle. Enjoy the party. On the house, of course." He even attempted a small, awkward smile before hurrying off to manage the rest of his appended schedule. So Elena mingled. It was strange. For years she had been a ghost at these events, a pair of hands in the shadows. Now people sought her out. A gallery owner asked if she ever performed contemporary classical works and handed her a card. A woman from the city's cultural office talked about a summer music series in the park. The conversations weren't long or deep, but they were real. They saw her as a person, an artist, not a piece of the furniture. But her mind kept drifting back to the piano bench, to those few minutes when the entire world had shrunk down to the space between her heart and the keys. She felt both exhausted and more alive than she could remember. As the party began to wind down, the crowd thinning, she found herself standing by one of the large windows overlooking the city. The lights twinkled like fallen stars. She was staring out, not really seeing them, replaying the maestro's words in her head. A seed, not a stone. A quiet voice beside her said, "It never feels the same, does it? The world after." She turned. It was the elderly woman from the front row. She was holding a wrap around her shoulders, ready to leave. "I'm sorry?" Elena asked. The woman smiled. "A moment like that, when you finally do the thing you are always afraid to do. It changes everything outside, but it changes everything inside more. The world looks different now, yes?" Elena nodded slowly. "It does. It feels bigger and smaller all at once." "That's exactly right," the woman said, her eyes wise and kind. "Bigger because you know what you're capable of. Smaller because you're not so afraid of it anymore." She reached out and patted Elena's arm. "Don't let it become just a nice story, a thing that happened once. Let it be the door you walk through." With that, she gave a final smile and turned, joining her husband who was waiting by the ballroom doors. He offered her his arm, and they walked out together, her words settled in Elena's chest. Let it be the door you walked through. She gathered her things, her simple purse, her folder of now useless safe sheet music. She walked out of the grand ballroom, through the now quiet lobby of the convention center, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool night air. The city sounds rushed in cars, distant sirens, the hum of life. It was a shock after the sealed, rarefied world of the gala. She took a deep breath, the air fresh and a little sharp. She started walking toward the bus stop, her heels clicking on the pavement. Before the night's event, this walk would have been filled with the quiet hum of resignation. Another job done. A paycheck. A return to her small, quiet life. Now, every step felt different. The energy of what had happened was still buzzing in her veins. The faces of the audience, the sound of that silence, the feeling of the music pouring out unchecked replayed in her mind not like a memory, but like a new source of power. She arrived at her apartment building, an old brick structure with creaky floors. She climbed the stairs to her door, the familiar scent of old wood and her neighbor's cooking greeting her. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was. She flicked on the light. Her small living room was cluttered but cozy. Books piled on chairs, a blanket folded over the couch. And there, against the wall, was her piano. Not a sleek Steinway, but her old scarred upright. The one with the chipped middle C and the sticky A-flat key. The one that knew all her secrets. She dropped her purse and folder on the table. The folder fell open, spilling out the bland, simplified arrangements. She looked at them, the notes so basic and empty on the page. She felt a sudden, fierce dislike for them. They represented the cage. Without even taking off her coat, she walked to the piano. She sat on the worn bench, the familiar dip in the cushion welcoming her back. She opened the fallboard, revealing the familiar keys, yellowed with age. For a moment, she just sat there in the quiet of her own apartment. The echoes of the grand applause were gone. It was just her and the instrument again. This was the real test. Could she still find the music here, alone, without 1,000 people watching? She placed her fingers on the keys. They were cold. She thought about playing Nouveau Bianche again, to try and capture the feeling. But it didn't feel right. That piece belonged to that moment not, so she let her hands find their own way. She started with a simple, searching chord. Then another. It wasn't a song she knew. It was something new, something forming in the space between her heart and her hands right now. It was hesitant at first, a little messy. A wrong note here and there. But she didn't stop. She didn't go back to correct it. She let it be part of the music. The melody that began to emerge was different from the one at the gala. That had been about longing and release. This was something else. This was curiosity. This was a question. It was a little brighter, with a rhythm that felt like moving forward. It was the sound of a door opening and someone stepping out to see what was on the other side. She played for a long time, losing track of the minutes. The city night pressed against her windows, but in her apartment there was only this new, unfolding sound. When she finally stopped, her hands rested in her lap. A deep, peaceful quiet filled the room. She looked at her piano, this old, faithful friend. She wasn't just the ambiance pianist anymore. She wasn't just the student who had once been crushed by a great man's words. She was the woman who had led an audience to their feet. She was the woman who played what she felt. The next morning, she woke up with a new kind of purpose. The sun was streaming through her window. She made coffee, and while it brewed, she did something she hadn't done in years with any real hope. She sat at her small desk with her laptop. She didn't look for job listings for hotel, lobby gigs, or wedding reception pianists. Instead, she typed new words into the search bar. Local artist grant applications. Submission guidelines for solo piano recordings. Small venue concert series. It was scary. Each click felt like a step onto untested ground. Rejection was almost guaranteed. But the fear felt different now. It wasn't a wall that stopped her. It was just a feeling she had to walk through. Later that week, she gathered all the sheet music from the fancy event, the safe arrangements. She put them in a pile. She didn't throw them away. They were a part of her story, too. But she put them on a high shelf in her closet. Then she took out the music she loved, the complex, emotional, challenging pieces. She placed them on the stand of her old upright piano. She also took out a blank notebook. On the first page, she wrote a single sentence, a reminder to herself. Asterisk, asterisk, play the truth. Not the tune. Asterisk, asterisk, one afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was an email. The subject line made her heart skip, following up from the Foundation Gala. It was from the chairwoman. She opened it with trembling fingers. The email was warm and direct. It thanked her again for her stunning performance. Then it got to the point. The foundation had a small, but respected, grant program for emerging artists. They also sponsored a series of free lunchtime concerts at the city's main public library atrium, a space known for its beautiful acoustics and busy crowds of ordinary people. The next season was being planned. Would she be interested in submitting a proposal for a short solo program? Elena read the email 3 times. This wasn't a job offer to be background noise. This was an invitation to be the music itself, to be heard. She looked from her phone screen to her waiting piano, its keys dusty in the afternoon light. She thought of the elderly woman's words. Let it be the door you walked through. She clicked reply. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a second before she began to type. Dear Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for your kind words and this incredible opportunity. I would be deeply honored to submit a proposal. As she typed, a feeling settled over her, solid and calm. It wasn't the dizzying high of the standing ovation. It was something better. It was the quiet, steady knowledge that she was finally on the right path. The woman who was told to play a simple tune had found her own voice. And she was just getting started.